Out of every tournament there's been since the anime's introduction, there's only been one that stands out to me as the very best. With a total of 17 unique battles to look at, the Alola League has a massive mix of the most brutal battles, some perfect endings to rivalries, and some incredible twists you'd never see coming. Today, I'm going to explain why I think this is the best Pokémon League in the entire anime's history, by reviewing each battle and giving my personal reasoning as to why this tournament as a whole was almost perfect. Especially towards the end, we get some of the best moments in the entire series, so you'll want to watch out for those, and with that all explained, let's dive in. The Alola League is actually quite different from the previous ones, where as long as you can sign up in time, anyone can compete regardless of skill, which as you can imagine resulted in there being a bunch of contestants. So many in fact, that the knockout format was left for the final 16, and to get into that you had to compete in the Battle Royal. For those who are unfamiliar with what a Battle Royal is, it's basically a battle that happens between a multitude of people at the same time, and it's a pretty big tradition in the Alola region. And once you get through that, the final 16 battle it out in a knockout stage until there's a winner, and whoever does that gets to battle the king of the Battle Royal Dome, the Masked Royal, who is essentially the strongest and most famous trainer in the region. At first, this might sound a bit messy, but I think the idea is fantastic, and the execution of this was awesome too. We got to see such a big variety of trainers from all over the region, from random one-off characters like the Master Fisherman, to the villains like Team Skull, and even famous people like Kahili and Alima. Personally, I loved seeing this because it felt like everything in the series had come full circle. Besides the Kahunas, pretty much everyone else was competing. The only person I kinda wish had competed that didn't was Lusamine, as she's a pretty big boss in the Alola games, but that's a very minor complaint. Some of my favourite moments from this episode are seeing Mimikyu going full speed ahead at any Pikachu it sees, and the stare down between Gladion and Ash. It was just so intense, and them helping each other out just after this was such a cold moment. By the end of this episode, the Battle Royal was finished, so the round of 16 lineups were officially announced, and they looked incredibly promising. And those were Ash vs Faber, Alima vs Guzma, Hal vs Principal Oak, Mallow vs Lana, Sophocles vs Mina, Jesse vs James, Kiawe vs Acerola, and Lily vs Gladion. This matchmaking was actually kind of brutal, but also peak, so let's talk about them. Starting in chronological order, let's start off with Ash vs Faber, and this was chaotic to say the least. We immediately see the villainous psychic specialist at work, forcing out Ash's Meltan before he gets to choose himself. He was actually spying on Ash and his Pokemon before the match, to see which one looked the weakest, and I really liked how this leaned into his evil side. Although, despite being well planned, Meltan actually won this battle in a way I don't think you would ever expect. Especially when Faber called for Hypno to use Hypnosis, you'd think it would be a pretty simple win for him, right? But it's never that simple, and instead of falling asleep, Meltan ran directly towards it and actually ate some of the metal ring that was attempting to hypnotize it. As you can imagine, this absolutely broke Hypno and allowed for an easy victory, but man, what a chaotic way to win a fight. To finish off my thoughts on each battle, I'm going to put them all in a tier list so you can see how they rank relative to each other. Overall, Ash and Faber was a really funny battle to watch with some really creative ideas that I don't think I could have come up with in a million years, so I'm going to give this a solid B tier. Alima vs Guzma was up next, and oh boy, this was a strategic masterclass from Guzma, but Alima definitely held his own. Kangaskhan did really well at the start of the battle, and this especially became more evident when it Mega Evolved. I remember when I first watched this, I was super shocked because we literally hadn't seen Mega Evolution in 3 years, and this was a really nice surprise for me. But little did we know that this power-up was actually his downfall, because after a while, Guzma picked up on the fact that the big Kangaskhan would hesitate or flinch every time its baby was in front of it. This presented another villain-like character in the perfect way, and was also quite a nice revenge moment for the Battle Royal, as Alima single-handedly eliminated 99% of Team Skull. And for that, I'll be putting this in the A tier, as the tactics actually felt intentional, and hyped up Guzma's future battles really well. The Hal and Principal Oak battle was the one we saw the least of, but this definitely makes sense in my opinion. Both characters weren't really that important to the series, and had very little screen time, but at least the battle still had a funny moment where Exeggutor gets KO'd by a Focus Blast. I'll just give this a quick C tier and move on. Following that, we had Mallow vs Lana, and you could immediately tell that Mallow was super nervous about this battle. If you've watched the rest of the series, you'd know she's probably the companion with the least battling experience, and she was also the last one to get a Z-Ring. And unlike the rest of the Alola gang, she hadn't mastered her Z move yet, so she was in a very awkward spot before she even started, which is probably why she was so nervous. nervous. On the flip side, Lana was really confident during this battle, as she knew to keep her distance by using Sparkling Aria, because if Zarina got in close, she was in trouble. But when it finally got in close, she had one final trick up her sleeve, and that was Primarina knowing Icy Wind, which of course dealt massive damage. This made Mallow just feel so hopeless during the moment that she even tried to give up, which I understand sounds kinda stupid when she's gotten this far, but in my opinion they wrote it in such a way that created such a special moment between the two. And the fact that this was the catalyst for her pulling off the Z move for the first time was just amazing. She did lose moments later admittedly, but this was still a big step up for Mallow as a whole, so this is a W for both of them in my opinion. Overall this was just fantastic. It was a nice change of pace from the constant action as they focus more on emotions, and this might be a hot take, but I'm going to put this in the A tier. Next up was Battle of the Bugs between Sophocles and Mina, and wow, this was super fast paced. The aerial fight made this battle so much better than I remember it being, but I will admit Sophocles didn't really do much. He kinda just said to Vikavolt like, hey, can you chase that flying bee thing? That'd be great. Mina knew her Rabombi's strengths and did well to avoid its attacks for most of the battle at least. The coolest part about this battle was when Vikavolt anticipated where Rabombi would dodge to and swooped in and grabbed it between its pincers all on its own. This is what I meant by Sophocles not really doing all that much during this battle. Like there's no way Togedemaru is doing that or something similar on its own. If he was more in control of his Vikavolt, this would be a B tier, but for that alone I'm gonna have to knock this into C tier unfortunately. And then we have the battle between Jessie and James, and oh boy, this is a funny battle to think about. Jessie was so confident that she was the better trainer, she just told James to take a fall and lose, but this didn't really go to plan. As she was using Wobbuffet, she couldn't really attack other than using Mirror Coat or counter, but she didn't even use that properly. She kinda just told Wobbuffet to deflect them rather than firing the attacks back at the Marini, which was really stupid honestly. So eventually James won the battle because it didn't do any damage back. It's a shame honestly, because this battle actually had a lot of potential, especially if Jessie used Mimikyu, but because it didn't exactly unlock it, I'm gonna have to give this a D tier. The penultimate battle of the initial knockout rounds is Kiawe versus Acerola, and I really like this battle. It was a super fast paced battle that constantly went back and forth and had some pretty unique elements to it, like when Marowak got hit by a Shadow Punch. Gengar has the ability Cursed Body, and in the games it only disables a move when you get hit by one, but in the anime it stops the opponent moving altogether, and although completely busted, I actually kind of like it. The anime always comes up with fun ways to spice up battles, and this was only the first of this battle, and the second was right after that too. Whilst Marowak was stuck, she then told her Gengar to use Thief and stole his bone. Tactically speaking, this was absolutely perfect for Acerola, because this made 3 of Marowak's 4 attacks completely unusable as they relied on its bone, which is absolutely genius, I can't lie. But despite all of that, in true anime fashion, this wasn't the end for Kiawe and Marowak somehow, because after he was set free from the Curse Body, they went for an Iron Head, and I'm not joking when I say this, it literally went inside Gengar, pause, and retrieved his bone and came back with a vengeance. This was just absolute chaos the entire way through, and I really like how unpredictable it was, so I'ma slap this in A tier. Last up was the sibling showdown between Lily and Gladion, and this felt quite similar to the Mallow vs Lana battle, but slightly more competent on both sides, which feels weird to compare someone with such a tiny unevolved fox to someone who has a fully evolved physically attacking beast, and somehow the latter is less prepared, but hey, that's how it feels, and it's kind of funny. I did like how Lily and Snowy ended up playing very defensive at the start by hiding in the snow to dodge attacks, and then flipped it on its head soon after by firing off Sub-Zero Slammer. I know this is really unlikely, but can you imagine if this Z move actually destroyed his Umbreon and Lily ended up beating him? That would have been hilarious. But let's be honest, they were never gonna let Gladion make this battle remotely close. I still enjoyed watching it, however, so I'm gonna give this a B tier. Considering we've only made it through 1 of 4 knockout stages, the amount of positives already put this on such a high pedestal for me. Of course there were some hiccups to be improved upon, like seeing more of Hal vs Principal Oak and Sophocles vs Mina, but at the same time I understand why they kept these battles short. So generally it was a very solid start, and things are about to heat up even more in the quarterfinals, especially when the matchups were announced. Those being Gladion vs James, Ash vs Hal, Kiawe vs Sophocles, and finally Guzma vs Lana. And for the most part, these are absolute bangers. The quarterfinals kicked off between Gladion and James, and it was about as one-sided as you can expect, especially considering Gladion used his ace Lycanroc. The Z-move Collision was a really nice callback to when Ash fought Nanu for his island trial, and he even mentions this during the moment, which I really liked. It just shows how much of an impression Ash has made on Gladion, even if if he hadn't beaten him up to this point. And that was literally it for this battle. Nothing really happened as it wasn't even the main focus of the episode, so for that I'll have to give this a D tier sadly. The main focus of the episode was actually Ash training Rowlet for his upcoming battle against Hau and Decidueye, and this battle was a rollercoaster of emotions, that's for sure. I do get why they focused on it though. Ash kinda realized it would be near impossible for him to beat Decidueye without learning a new move, and with a little training from the Pokemon Rowlet used to live with, it ended up learning Feather Dance. Well, sort of, I'll get onto that later. Now to talk about the actual battle, and I love the way this battle started with Z moves instead of finishing with them. I remember watching it for the first time and knowing I was in for an absolute belter of a match if this is how it started. And the way Decidueye was able to trap Rowlet with Spirit Shackle was so creative. I never thought it could be used that way, but as always, Ash has a way of getting out of these things. Remember how I said Rowlet sort of learnt Feather Dance but didn't? That's because he kind of learnt an entirely new move. The closest thing I can compare it to is like Detect, but instead of just dodging it normally, it sheds a layer of its far off in order to dodge the attack. I tried thinking of a name for this, but honestly I'm kinda clueless. What would you guys call this move? Without learning this, Ash and Rowlet would have been absolutely wiped to the floor with, but that's what made this battle so intense for me. Watching this new move develop from start to finish was just so baffling, but kept me on the edge of my seat the entire time. And when Ash was originally deemed to have lost this battle, I couldn't believe it. The Unova League flashbacks were setting in, I can't lie. But Hala definitely made the right call, and I'm glad he did. I get it's considered controversial or plot armor in some respects, but without this, we wouldn't have had some of Ash's greatest ever battles, so who cares? For a 1v1 quarterfinal match, I genuinely loved it, so I'm gonna put this in S tier. Before we move on to the next battle, Ash's Meltan did something strange in between the battles, as we get a close-up of it spinning at the highest point it could find. You might be wondering how it ended up in this situation. Honestly, I couldn't tell you. It has no arms or legs, and although we don't really know what's going on right now, you'll find out later on. Kiawe vs Sophocles was the third round of the quarterfinals, and the matchup was Vikavolt versus Charizard.
Not another one?
This battle went off to a flying start, Sophocles especially because he dominated the first part of the battle through multiple well thought out strategies. Waiting on lower ground for Charizard to close in before firing off a super effective Zap Cannon was just excellent. And the cliffhanger this episode leaves you on is just beautiful. It leaves you with so many questions. Is it over for Charizard already? Can it escape the Z move? If so, how will Kiawe and it come back from this? It's honestly perfect, and I'm kinda glad I watched this after the whole season aired so I didn't have to wait a week to find out because that would have killed me. Going back to Sophocles, him and Vikavolt slowing down Charizard definitely made this more of a fair fight than I initially thought, especially when it came to watching the final collision between Supersonic Sky Strike and Wild Charge. It really made me feel like anyone could have won that, and that's what made this battle so great. If this was a head-to-head clash instead of at a 45-degree angle, I genuinely think it could have been a draw, but thankfully for Kiawe's sake, Charizard coming from higher up definitely saved him. I know I've basically only mentioned Sophocles for this battle, but it really gave him some much needed love and respect as a Pokemon trainer, as previously he always used to overthink or panic, so despite losing, it's still a massive win for him honestly. As for Kiawe, I think he kept up extremely well despite being under pressure for 90% of the battle, so I think it was a very deserved win for him. Tier list wise, I think this is a great battle for the A tier, as everything other than a few minor details were just insanely good. For the ultimate battle of the quarterfinals, we had the most brutal one, and that is not to be taken lightly. Remember when I mentioned they played into Guzma's evil side against Alima? That was absolutely nothing compared to his battle against Lana. As soon as the battle starts, he leaves her in the dust. You see, when Ash battled Guzma originally, he didn't know about Golisopod's first impression. Lana knew this was likely on the way and warned Primarina in advance, but it never came. So instead, she took the initiative and made the first move, and this was a fatal error. As soon as she went to attack, Guzma called for Throat Chop, completely disabling Primarina's strongest move, Sparkling Aria. And this isn't even the worst thing he did. From using Poison Jab over and over again, to even splitting her Z move in half, this guy was the definition of savage. But as villainous as they made him out to be, I kinda loved the way they presented him. He was the perfect representation of a gang leader who no one wants to mess with, and that was just incredible to watch. Other than at the start, I didn't really mention Lana during this battle because, well, she tried her best in the nicest possible way. As a whole, this battle was absolutely brutal, and as much as it kinda sucked to see Lana get destroyed, this hyped up the upcoming semi-final match so much to the point where I think this battle is S tier honestly. The quarterfinals had a kind of slow start, but other than that, they shined so brightly. Every battle's ending felt justified, and they all incredibly fun to watch and had me on the edge of my seat. And with that, the semi-finals were announced, and the matchups were the equivalent of fireworks, those being Kiawe vs Gladion and Ash vs Guzma. These battles also went up from a 1v1 to a 2 vs 2 format, so if you enjoyed the last battles, the next are only getting better. And the semis started off with a bang. What a brilliant fight Kiawe vs Gladion was. I loved the tempo of this battle. Gladion did kinda spam Stone Edge for half the battle, but against a fire type trainer, can you blame him for that? Kiawe finding his way around that with Flare Blitz and then hitting hard with Iron Head was incredible. We really saw Gladion's trust between him and Lycanroc come full show during this battle. He even taught him a workaround with Outrage so it doesn't go completely mindless and attack aimlessly, which is just one of the few tricks he had up his sleeve during the tournament, and they only get better from here. Turtonator obliterating Lycanroc with a Focus Blast felt so out of nowhere, but honestly I found it kind of hilarious. And then Gladion's quick thinking during the Z move to change Silvalite into a fire type was awesome. Despite being on the back foot, he was still able to come up with a solution in a tight spot, and that's why he won. I genuinely forgot how fantastic of a battle this was to watch, and Kiawe's speech at the end officially acknowledging Gladion as a rival was so cool, and for that I'm going to give this an A tier. And for the second match of the semi-finals, we have the most anticipated rematch of the entire Sun and Moon series, Ash vs Guzma. They had been hyping up this battle since the moment Guzma entered the league, and it definitely didn't disappoint. Although she wasn't part of the battle, someone I'd quickly like to talk about is Plumeria and the way they portrayed her during this time. She was essentially a narrator for Guzma's backstory and tried to keep him in check by warning him not to underestimate Ash, and even though it sounds like it would break the flow, I actually think it made things way better. Considering Torracat was at a huge disadvantage, they put up such a good fight against his Golisopod, landing some huge shots to even trigger its ability Emergency Exit. And considering a Fire Blast was on the way, Tizzle got absolutely fried when it switched back in. Of all times it wanted to switch out, typically it was when a Fire Blast was on the way. It was such poor timing for Guzma. This is where Guzma's trauma started to unfold, and he absolutely lost it. Looking back actually, I can imagine something like this would probably be going through his head right about now.
How did I lose? All my friends said I'm the best. All my yes men say I'm the greatest. Surely I could have lost. No, this is a simulation. This is a dream. This is bullshit.
Of course the wording's a little off for the part of the battle it happened in, but it still gives me that kind of vibe, and that led us into the second episode of this battle. And just wow, the further we got into the battle, the more it heated up. We definitely saw more of Guzma's battling style against Lana at the start of the next episode, with the use of a lot more poison jabs and throat chops, and Ash's determination to never run away really started to get to him. The message that began to unfold behind this battle wasn't that he was this overwhelmingly powerful trainer who was unbeatable, but rather a guy who would just hide in the shadows and was scared of losing battles. Don't get me wrong, he's still a very strong trainer. He got to the semi-final of the Alola League without much trouble, but as we know, Ash is not the kind of guy to give up until it's truly over. And despite taking a direct hit Thunderbolt and a Gigavolt Havoc head on, this seemed to rub off on Golisopod as well. And this really put it into perspective for Guzma, giving him no choice but to give it his all until the very end. And that's what I love about this battle in particular. Don't get me wrong, the fight itself was great. The pacing was really good all the way through and there was a ton of action. However, it's the storytelling and character building that makes this battle so special, teaching Guzma a much needed lesson to improve as a trainer. Even if he lost in the end, the value of what he learned from battling Ash really outdoes anything he'd done in the tournament in my opinion. If you couldn't tell, this is my favourite battle of the tournament so far, an easy S tier to end off the semi-finals. The tournament as a whole so far has been absolutely incredible, very little complaints so far, although I would like to briefly discuss why I think this on its own is so much better than the Masters 8 tournament, at least from a writing perspective. Instead of just putting all the strongest trainers together to just make a massive tournament, they built up each character over the series and really focused on telling an incredible story through their battles. Every battle has had a justified result, and even when people lose, they gain something from that, like teaching Mallow and Guzma to never give up, and something as simple as people like Kiawe to understand that Ash isn't his only rival, whereas in the Masters 8 tournament, it didn't feel like the loser gained anything. Like literally everyone except Iris, who lost in the quarterfinals, just felt like a stepping stone and didn't really gain anything from it. You can say like, oh, they got stronger, but that's such a poor and lame result in my opinion. Anyway, enough on the Masters 8 tournament for now. I'll speak more on that at the end of the video. Let's get talking about Ash vs Gladion, shall we? Remember when I mentioned that Meltan was spinning on top of that building ages ago? Turns out this was actually to call its friends along, and then after some vibing and jiving, this actually caused them them all to merge and evolve into Melmetal. Gladion was getting used to his unpredictable battle style, but with a brand new Pokemon this would definitely change the course of the battle. And with that, the final began. Ash vs Gladion with a 3 vs 3 battle to win the first ever Pokemon League hosted in Alola. To begin with, Melmetal was absolutely slapping up Silvally, until Gladion changed it into a fighting type of course, but for its first battle as Melmetal, it did really well. Double Iron Bash was super powerful, and Flash Cannon was a great alternative when they got in too close. Pikachu vs Silvally was absolutely insane. I love how this battle turned out as speed against speed, but more importantly, the finishing Iron Tail was incredible. Catapulting itself off of its own Electro Web is genius, and it was perfectly executed. Ash using Melmetal was a very good surprise factor on its own, but Gladion also did this later in the battle, and this was all thanks to a Zoroark. And because its ability is Illusion, it's able to mimic the last Pokemon in his party's appearance, and this caught Ash completely off guard. I mean, can you blame him? I'd also be flabbergasted if a Lycanroc used Night Gaze, considering only 3 Pokemon can learn that move, and believe it or not, it's not one of them. After Pikachu broke the Zoroark's illusion, this is where the first chapter of the battle ended. This had so many twists and turns with momentum shifting between both sides, it was amazing, and this followed into the next episode. The Z-move clash was just... I'm not gonna lie, I'm running out of words, bro. Even though I've watched this battle over and over again, it still gives me the chills now. It was essentially the only thing he could do, and the fact that he pulled it off was just amazing. And you know what's special? Despite being in the final with one of the most important battles of their entire life, they still managed to share a moment of joy just before the final showdown, and it really just shows how much they were enjoying the battle. This kind of thing is very rarely animated, so I think it was a really nice touch. It was down to a Lycanroc showdown, and just wow. This fight is one of the main reasons Lycanroc became my absolute favorite Pokemon. This 1v1 is just absolutely peak. The way Lycanroc and Ash constantly found ways around Gladion's Lycanroc using Stone Edge was simple but effective, especially when it used them as a stepping stone. I really liked that. I know there's been a lot of remembering, but remember when I mentioned in the semi-finals that Gladion had trained Lycanroc to control itself during Outrage? Turns out it even learned to shake off the confusion by biting its own paw, which was just phenomenal. It sounds super simple, but Gladion's dedication to victory is just outstanding. Don't get me wrong, everything up to this point has just been peak, but personally, nothing tops the final clash for me. Using counter against counter after saving it for the whole fight perfectly encapsulated this battle for me, full of surprises and not knowing what's coming next. And the fact this moment made Ash become champion of the Alola region was just phantasmagorical. Man, I love that word, big up Deji. Honestly, a flawless battle in my opinion. To the top of S tier it goes, and that means Ash can finally battle the Masked Royal. However, during the ceremony crowning Ash as champion, an alien invasion begins to happen, as 3 Guzzlord appear from different wormholes and start destroying the area. They all got sent back into their ultra wormholes eventually, but the one Ash and the Masked Royal battled actually ended up revealing a few things that would change the course of that upcoming bout. Not only did Ash's Poipole come back to save the day at a crucial moment, but had since evolved and learnt Thunderbolt, which is the entire reason they were able to send their Guzzlord back in the first place. They did this by simultaneously firing off Gigavolt Havoc, and once this happened, the Masked Royal's mask actually got blown off, which revealed to everybody that the Masked Royal was actually Professor Kukui. Although we already knew this as the audience, the important thing here is that Ash didn't know, which led us into their battle excellently, especially with a certain Pokemon lurking in the shadows watching everything play out, but more on that later. And with all of that done and dusted, it was time to watch the fiery display that was Ash vs Kukui. In the first episode, it begins with the first fiery showdown between Ash's Torracat and Kukui's Incineroar, and this sure made for a thrilling start to the match. Ash's idea of raising Torracat's speed to the upper limit right away was a really smart idea on his end, and the fact this didn't phase Incineroar seems overpowered, but in my opinion only hyped up the eventual outcome for me. And something that surprised me the most was Torracat's idea to try and take in the Blast Burn itself to power up. I just love the determination and passion Torracat had to overcome its rival so much. I'm kinda glad they came up with a logical reason to halt this 1v1 for now, as the rest of the battle wouldn't have had that anticipation for when they finally meet later on. With Lycanroc as the replacement, I was so incredibly hyped, and the way they used the broken Stone Edge was excellent. The way Lycanroc and Ash gel together is just absolutely perfect. They can think so quick on their feet, and the way they can execute their ideas is only second to Pikachu in my opinion. Seeing Kukui return Incineroar here was just like, "This is my boy!" he switched out Incineroar for his Braviary, and this is where the first episode left off. A great start to the battle, but the future episodes had much more to come. On to episode 2, Lycanroc vs Braviary was pretty mixed for me for obvious reasons. It was nice to see that Ash didn't forget about counter for this battle, and unlike the Jesse vs James battle, it actually deflected the attacks towards Braviary, causing some big damage, but it definitely hit back harder with Skydrop and Superpower, and man, it sucked to see my boy go down so soon. At the end of the day, if you were slammed into the ground at Mach speed from 800 yards in the air, I think you'd also lose at least 90% of your energy. I don't care who you are, you ain't getting out of that. Rowlet soon came out and pulled off an aerial masterclass. The tennis match between Seed Bomb and Steel Wing was amazing, and Rowlet finishing off Braviary afterwards was just awesome. And I don't even know what to say about this next battle. It was just so mind-boggling. How else do you even put it? The fact Rowlet was able to avoid the Solar Beam with a Feather Dance just blows my mind. Rowlet just ends up in the goofiest scenarios, and I love them for that. Like, logically it works. We've seen it happen in the Howl battle, but how they even thought to make this happen in the way they did is just incredible. Worst part is, it went down soon after with basically 0 damage dealt, and Ash brought back Torracat to see how his power was holding up from earlier. And let's just say Torracat was absolutely cooking. It effortlessly dealt with his Venusaur, but he surprisingly withdrew it right after. This ended up leading a completely new matchup that was Ash's Pikachu versus Kukui's Empoleon, and not really much happened during this. But I will say, actually taking the time to show them both having so much fun is a massive W. After Pikachu got dizzy from the Whirlpool, it was Melmetal's time to shine, and oh boy did he shine. Took absolutely nothing, zilch if you will, from Empoleon's water attack, smacked it with a double Iron Bash, and it was just done like that. With his ace returning to the field, Incineroar did exactly what Ash's Torracat did against his Melmetal, by making quick work of it to see how it's feeling. And to no surprise, it was absolutely cooking, so he returned it swiftly afterwards in order to send out his Lucario. What Ash did next shocked everyone, and this was to reveal his Beast Ball to send out Naganadel, which ended off the second episode. Before moving on to the third episode, I'd quickly like you to imagine you're living in the anime universe for a second, just as a normal civilian in the Alola region. You decided to watch the battle out of interest as it's a pretty big event, and you see this random kid you've likely never heard of before until recently have a new form of Lycanroc you've never seen, a mythical Pokemon you've only read about in legends, and finally an Ultra Beast that you've definitely never seen before. The funny part is, they don't even know this kid technically also owns a Solgaleo too. Imagine the thoughts going through your mind as a normal person. Not really relevant at all, I just thought it'd be funny to bring up. On to the third episode we go. This episode started off with an absolute banger. Seeing an Ultra Beast get into the rhythm of battle was really intriguing, as of course they have power but no experience, so getting off hits was really difficult at first. But over the course of the fight, you could really tell it was learning how to get around Lucario's attacks as well as hit back harder. Lucario's extreme speed was absolutely brutal. I didn't realize how overpowered this move would be, and it really caught me off guard in a positive way. Something else that caught me off guard during this battle was when Naganadel replicated exactly what Incineroar did earlier against Melmetal, where he forced him into a collision and was able to land a point-blank attack where Lucario could do absolutely nothing about it. Especially for Naganadel's first battle, it did incredibly well. It was so awesome to see it win it too, honestly. I really enjoyed that, and this led us into the best and final battle between Incineroar and Torracat, and man, this was so peak, there's no other way to describe it. Watching their Blaze abilities activate and grow to levels we've only ever seen in Infinite was absolutely unbelievable, and towards the end it even seemed to surpass them too. Oh boy, I'm probably gonna get some comments about that. And the Z-move collision was definitely the best way to end this fight, but that's not even the best part. The fact that it evolves over its rival's unconscious body is one, kinda funny, but two, the best conclusion to a rivalry in the entire series. I genuinely don't think there's another moment that's as special that occurs at the end of such a fierce battle. It was genuinely perfect. And the mental part is, that's not even the end of the episode yet. As Professor Kukui goes to send out his final Pokemon, Tapu Koko descends from the heavens and demands the battle alongside him instead of his last Pokemon. As a quick side note, I really want to know what his 6th and final Pokemon is. It clearly wasn't something incredibly OP, as he wouldn't let Tapu Koko replace it, but I have always been curious to see what it would be. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you guys have any guesses on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And similar to the last episode, Ash sends out Naganadel as its opponent, and that's where we left off. Okay, so on to the ultimate episode of this battle, and man, this was fireworks left, right and center. The power and speed on display was absolutely mesmerizing. They animated it so well too. I especially liked how it concealed healed itself with Dragon Pulse, and then fired back with a direct hit X scissor right after. That was really cool, but that was absolutely nothing in comparison to Pikachu versus Tapu Koko. Where do I even begin with this? The exchanges they had were amazing. It was clear since the last time they battled, Ash and Pikachu had gotten much stronger. And now for the second Z-move showdown of the match. What an absolute show this was. Every little detail about this final collision was exquisite, and seeing Ash and Pikachu go Super Saiyan was pretty funny to see. Watching Ash become victorious at the end still gives me the chills to this day. What an absolute banger way to finish this tournament as a whole. This easily rockets to the top of the tier list as the number 1, and that's where the tier list as well as the tournament ends. All I can say is just, what a Pokemon League. There was so much love poured into this tournament, and series as a whole for that matter. I just wish people didn't write off Sun and Moon because of the slightly goofy art style, that's all. I know I technically did just tell you the entire ending to the whole series, but there's still a ton of amazing battles and beautifully written storylines in this series that I didn't talk about, and would highly recommend finding some time to watch it yourself at some point if you haven't already. In comparison to the Masters 8 tournament, which was an 8 out of 10, I'm gonna be fair and give this a 9.5 out of 10. I was incredibly tempted to give this a 10 out of 10 because all of the major battles that mattered were amazing, but I do think some could have been a bit better, like Jesse vs James, so hey, I'm being fair here. Thank you very much once again to the creators of the Pokemon anime for creating something incredibly special to me, and thank you for watching this video too. If you'd like to see my retrospect on the Masters 8 tournament, feel free to click the video on screen, and I'll catch you guys in a bit. Bye bye. And who knows, you might even see a Kalos League review in the future too.